But
So
actually, we have over 300, is it 300 or 360 something dialects that people
mm,
speak. Yes,
yeah, yeah, the different dialects and things across.
yes.
Yeah, that is fascinating. I took in college, I think I took one semester because I'm a social studies major teaching social studies, and I took one semester half year of African history, but I wasn't the best student and I didn't pay a lot of attention. Plus there's like so much that happens in Africa. I mean, America, in North America we have Canada, the United States and Mexico. In Africa, how many countries are there in Africa? 51, 52 or something. Um, there's a lot of history there, and that's even forget about the white European colonizers. If you're just talking native African old history, there's a lot there. So yeah, hundreds of dialects and lots of languages and histories and cities as old as anything else in the world. It's pretty cool. But today we'll turn our attention to American history because that's what's on the GED test. Um, so yeah, thanks for logging in. So last week we started a little discussion, and today we'll finish up a discussion of pre-revolutionary America. Okay, so this is the transition of the British colonies. What got them to the point where they declared their independence? Of course, I mark that moment with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. What year, or what was the date of the signing of the Declaration of Independence? I'm not big on memorizing a bunch of dates, but this is a pretty big. This is one you ought to know. We mark it with Independence Day. What's the date of Independence Day each year?
Independence is July 4th.
Yeah, July 4th. So what year they signed it on July 4th? What year was it signed?
I think 1776.
Yeah, 1776. So July. So that's kind of
Hey!
like, yeah. So that's like if you have American history, that's a big line drawn right across the middle. Before 1776 and after 1776. You also then, there's also another big line drawn maybe when uh, they win the American Revolution and the British sign a treaty, I think the Treaty of Paris or something, um, ending the war. There's also, you could draw a big line when they write the US Constitution, which happens about 10 years later. Um, but I mean, yeah, you definitely want to know July 4th, 1776, because that's the moment when maybe not officially, but at least in the minds of many of the people living in the British colonies, in their mind, they started a new nation, right? They did not want to be, they declared their independence from being British colonies. And in Africa, you have very similar stories. I mean, at the same time that Britain had colonies here in North America, which also included Canada, and Canada has its own history of breaking away in a very different way, breaking away from being British colonies. They never really did. I mean, they're still part of the British realm. They're not part of the British company or country, but um, there were British colonies in Canada, and there's British colonies across Africa, as well as Italian colonies, Portuguese colonies, Spanish colonies, French. Um, who would be the other big colonizing forces in Africa? I think Italy, I think Spain, maybe not Spain. Italy, France, Britain. I don't know really who else. Those are kind of the biggest. Portuguese a little bit. And of course, you have colonies being set up in South America, Spanish and Portuguese largely. So that when you're looking at the 1700s, 1800s, a lot of those European countries had colonies across the world, right? Even in Asia. Okay, it was a time. If you open up a history textbook, they call it like the era of colonization. These big European powers were spreading their people across the globe and just declaring this is a British colony, this is an Italian colony, this is a French colony, and big time in Africa, really across the whole world. Then 1700s, 1800s, you have the story of those colonized people, whether they are British, sort of British people in America, North America, or you have, um, you know, any other the history of the British colonies in India, or British, Italian, French colonies in Africa. Every every colony has its own story that you see through the 1700s, 1800s of having their own moment of declaring independence. Sometimes it happens through the courts, and sometimes those countries, Britain, France, give up their colonies peacefully. Sometimes they fight wars. Sometimes it's a little bit of both. So this is, it's a moment in history when, and it kind of starts. It's the breaking away from of these colonies across the globe. I don't think America was like the first, but it was among the first, and it starts a wave through the 1800s of people across the globe saying, "Hey, you know what? I don't feel British. I shouldn't be British." You know, African people, Asian people saying, "We don't want these people here anymore. We're just like the Americans, as we've seen." Um, the Stamp Act, the British are taxing the American colonies, and the American people start to view themselves as American, not British, and they say, "Hey, we don't like this anymore. We want to change this." Right? So this week, we're looking at the lead up to that. What changed their minds? What changed their feelings? So let's look at this document here. We got about halfway through. So we talked about the Stamp Act, right? Um, Writs of assistance. It was taxes. The British, well, of course, the people in America. Sometimes I call them British. Sometimes I call them Americans. They were Americans because they did call this land America, but it wasn't a country, right? It was the British colonies in America. Um, the British were taxing the American people, the British people in America. But we looked at the Stamp Act. You had to buy special paper, and some people in the colonies boycotted. Right? We talked about boycotts, and then we talked a little bit about the Declaratory Act and the Townshend Acts, and it started to get worse. The British were really almost punishing the people in America. Now we're going to look at the Boston Massacre. Let's just look ahead. Boston Massacre, 1770. So we're getting a little closer to 1776. We see that date coming closer. The British make the Americans skittish. The massacre, trial and error. Then we're going to look at the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts. If something is intolerable, what does that word mean?
You cannot take it.
Yeah, I can't stand it. I can't take it, right? I'm not going to put up with this. It's intolerable. The intolerable acts are the names for these four acts, these four laws that the British passed, and then the people in the colonies called them the Intolerable Acts. So we'll look at those. And then that's going to lead us up to the moment when, a few years later, 1776, they would declare their independence. So that's what we're looking at today. The causes, the lead up to the American independence. Okay. And think about it, I think what's most interesting in history is when you read about these are regular people, um, living lives just like you and me in Pennsylvania. I'm in central Pennsylvania. Um, you know, Americans, British colonists were just going about their lives, right? They owned a shop or they worked at a factory. Well, there weren't a lot of factories, but maybe they made something at home. Maybe you were a farmer. You're just going about your life. And yet, maybe you read in the newspaper, or most often, not everybody read the newspaper. Not everybody could read. Um, and a good portion of the people in America were also slaves, so we have to keep that in mind. But the people would, they were becoming more and more upset. We looked at these taxes, about how these taxes really started to get in people's face. If you tax tea or you tax sugar, okay, well, maybe my sugar costs a little bit more. But if you do this Stamp Act, and I personally, just a regular person, I have to go out and buy special paper and everything costs more because the person who made it has to buy special paper. If I want to mail a letter, it has to be on this special stamped paper. That's in my life. That's in my face, right? So people are starting to get a little more upset. The other thing we're going to look at is, because of this tension that's been growing from what we read last week, there are British soldiers living in America, in the American colonies. And so you have this tension now. Okay, me, I'm an everyday person in Pennsylvania, and I'm beginning to think of myself as American. I don't think of myself as a British person. And yet in my cities, we're going to look at Boston, in Philadelphia, in New York, but especially Boston. A lot of things happen in Boston, Massachusetts. Um, there's British soldiers there to keep the peace, to keep what they thought of was the peace, because the American colonists were getting more upset, more agitated, boycotting things, rebelling more. So we're really going to get a feel for that tension today. Uh, what it was like to walk down the street and see a bunch of British soldiers there, as basically doing police work, right? Keeping the American colonists peaceful, just like, in a dangerous neighborhood or at a dangerous time, police cars patrol or stand on the corner, and just them being there is going to have an effect, right? Okay, so let's jump in. Today we're going to look at the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. Those are two big protests. You got to talk about them if you're talking about the lead up to the American Revolution. And then the Intolerable Acts. They get less talked about by students, but they're important too. Okay, so let me jump in here. We'll take turns. We'll go through. We'll talk. If you have any questions, just ask anytime. But let's jump in. I'll read these first two paragraphs. Can you guys see the screen okay?
Yes.
You can see it? Okay. Okay, the Boston Massacre, 1770. American blood was shed on American soil. The showdown between the British and the Americans was not simply a war of words. Blood was shed over this clash of ideals. Although large-scale fighting between American Minutemen and the British Redcoats did not begin until 1775, the 1770 Boston Massacre, I think we're missing a word. The 1770 Boston Massacre showed each side a taste of what was to come. What are American Minutemen? Have you heard that term before? What's a Minuteman? Jendaya, do you know what a Minuteman is? American Minutemen and British Redcoats. What are Minutemen?
Um, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's a British person.
Well, no, the British Redcoats. The Redcoats is the nickname for the British soldiers because they were, they're real fancy, old-fashioned 1700s uniform. They had their everyday soldiers had red coats, right? So they called them the Redcoats. That was their uniform. The American Minutemen are America. Of course, America isn't a country, right? So they don't have an American army because technically they're British. So the fighting force that started to form even at this time, 1770, um, unofficially, today we call, sometimes you hear in the news about militias. Back then it was real militias. There was no American army because there was no America, right? So the fighting force on the American side of this struggle were Minutemen. Okay, every town would have a militia. Your town wouldn't have an army, wouldn't have what we call a standing army. An army that's formed and ready. They would have Minutemen, basically the men of the town, and it was just it was all the men of the town would be ready if word came out that there was a battle or there was a struggle or something was going on against the British. They would be ready in a minute, right? And they didn't have a uniform. Everybody owned a gun back then, pretty much everybody owned a gun, and so in 1 minute you could be ready to fight. You'd grab your gun and run down to downtown or out to somebody's farm or wherever you heard the battle, the fighting, the struggle was. They were ready in 1 minute, so they called themselves Minutemen. Okay, so it says large scale fighting between American Minutemen and British Redcoats did not begin until 1775. The 1770 Boston Massacre showed each side a taste of what was to come. No colony was thrilled with the Townshend Acts, but nowhere was there greater resentment than in Boston, Massachusetts. British officials in Boston feared for their lives. When attempts were made to seize two of John Hancock's trading vessels, and he was a colonist, a later signer of the Declaration of Independence, so he was on the American side. When attempts were made to seize two of John Hancock's trading vessels, Boston was ready to riot. Parliament's Minister on American Affairs finally ordered 4 regiments to be moved to Boston. So Boston was a center of conflict. The people in Boston really hated the British, the way they were being treated by the British, the taxes, right? And so it says Parliament's Minister on American Affairs finally ordered 4 regiments to be moved to Boston. So that's 4 more groups of soldiers, British Redcoats, would be stationed in Boston to keep the peace. This is policing action to keep the peace of the people of Boston who were getting more angry and were made more angry because more British Redcoat soldiers were sent, right? So it's like we see in our news today all the time. The presence of the police, in this case British Redcoats, the presence of the police makes things worse, makes the tension higher, right? And makes it more likely that you're going to have a problem with the police. So same ideas back then as today. People are upset, so the government sends more police, in this case, British Redcoats, and the people become more upset because of that. And, that's, I don't know the answer to that question, but, that's the way things happen. Jendaya, could you read paragraphs 18 and 19?
Samuel Adams and James Otis did not take this lightly. Less than 3 weeks prior to the arrival of British troops, Bostonians defiantly, I don't know if I'm saying this right, defiantly
Hmm.
but nervously assembled in Faneuil Hall. But when the redcoats marched boldly through the town streets on October the 1st, the only resistance seen was on the facial expressions of the townspeople. The people of Boston had decided to show restraint. The other 12 colonies watched the Boston proceedings with great interest. Perhaps their fears about British tyranny were true. Moderates found it difficult to argue that the Crown was not interested in stripping away American civil liberties by having a standing army stationed in Boston. Throughout the occupation, sentiment shifted further and further away from the London government.
Okay, thank you. So again, there's tension. They send more troops to protect against something happening, and that causes the tension to rise. It says at the time, I guess the redcoats marched boldly through the streets on October 1st in Boston. The people of Boston decided to show restraint. So nothing happened immediately, but there was tension. And then it says the other 12 colonies were watching what was happening, right? Um, just like today when we read in the paper of something terrible happening, um, maybe something in the government does that you don't agree with. It didn't happen to you, but you sympathize with the people that it happened to, and the American people, the American colonists across all 13 colonies were watching Massachusetts, were watching Boston, and saying, "Hey, I'm not thrilled with the British taxes, the way we're being slammed with taxes on the Stamp Act and the tea and the sugar. And now watching how the British government reacts to the people in Boston makes me like the situation even less. I don't trust it. I don't like it." Um, Olawakimi, could you read paragraph 20?
Yeah. Oh, okay. I didn't know I can. On March 5th, oh, sorry, the massacre. On March 5, 1770, the inevitable happened. A mob of about 60 angry townspeople descended upon the guard at the customs house when reinforcements were called. The crowd became more unruly, hurling rocks and snowballs at the guard and reinforcements. In the heat of the confusing melee, the British fired without Captain Thomas Preston's command. Imperial bullets took the lives of 5 men, including Crispus Attucks, a former slave. Others were injured.
All right, thank you. And then to the right there is the famous engraving. They didn't have photographic cameras, so that's a drawing and engraving, and that showed up in the newspapers very quickly. I don't know if it was the next day, but like within a week, that was the image that everybody saw. So let's zoom in here. Okay. Um, this is the famous image that everybody saw in the newspaper next to the article about what happened. Okay. Now, 5 people were killed. It wasn't quite frankly, it wasn't a big deal. Um, there was some British soldiers guarding the customs house. People started to give them a problem. Reinforcements were called in. They were throwing rocks. Well, no, that's a big deal. Throwing rocks and snowballs at the guards. And then it became a riot. It became a problem. I mean, you've seen movies, you've seen the news. Um, Groups, crowds can get out of control. So just as we've seen even recently. This crowd of the colonists got out of control. The soldiers felt threatened and they fired on the crowd without their captain's command. Okay, so this is just like it'd be interesting to if somebody made a modern movie about it. You could imagine it's very chaotic. It's very scary. The soldiers were scared for their lives. There's a bunch, it says 60 angry townspeople, good sized crowd. People are throwing rocks at you. You're holding a gun. They shot, perhaps in self defense. You could say, right? 5 people were killed, including famously a former slave named Crispus Attucks. He was a black man. So some people say the first person killed in the if you call this the beginning of the American Revolution, some people say that Crispus Attucks, a former slave, a black man, was the first person killed in the American Revolution. I don't know that that fact really lines up. It's an interesting fact. I don't know that he's the first person killed in the American Revolution, but it's interesting. Crispus Attucks is the name, and that's true. That's historically true. Now, if you look at this picture, though, it doesn't quite look like a fair fight, does it? You have the British soldiers holding the guns, lined up, and then just look at all the blood in this picture. Oddly, there's also a little dog in the front. This was what showed up in the newspaper. Okay. Now, who does this picture make look like the bad guy? The Americans or the British?
The British.
Yeah, the British end up looking bad in this engraving. Okay. I don't know how many soldiers there ended up being. This reading gives us 60 people, 5 people were killed. So it was a big deal. They also then started calling it the Boston Massacre. So news went out across the colonies. Now, of course, they don't have Twitter or CNN or anything. So, people started to share the news over the days and weeks and months afterwards, and they started calling this the Boston Massacre. And some people point to that word and say, well, that was when the colonists called this, maybe even accidental, I don't know, not purposeful killing of 5 people, a massacre. They gave it a more exciting name than it really deserved, right? This isn't 100 people dying. This isn't, some people would say this is not a massacre. It's bad, but a lot of historians look at this and say the choice of the word massacre to refer to this event was on purpose to make it seem bad, right? It's the Americans trying to gain support against the British being there. So the reason even today we call it the Boston Massacre. We could call it something else, right? We could call it the Custom House murder or something like that. Or, we could call it a riot, the Boston riot. But by calling it the Boston Massacre, you point the finger of blame at the British soldiers, you make it seem really bad. And so even then they called it the Boston Massacre in order to get people to be against the British, right? So I think that's kind of interesting. So they take it to trial, right? Somebody's been shot. 5 people have been shot. It goes to court. So paragraph 21, it says trial and error. Captain Preston and 4 of his men were cleared of all charges in the trial that followed. 2 others were convicted of manslaughter, but were sentenced to a mere branding of the thumb. The lawyer who represented the British soldiers was none other than patriot John Adams. John Adams was a patriot, was an American colonist who supported the revolution later on and would become America's second president. John Adams was our second president after George Washington. That's him. He was the defense lawyer of the British soldiers. But he was a lawyer at the time. They were not, they're still 6 years away from the real revolution. And so he's just doing his job. He was doing his duty to defend the British soldiers. So interestingly, John Adams, America's second president, big time revolutionary guy, um, defended the soldiers in the Boston Massacre. Jendai, could you read paragraph 22?
At the same time, Preston's men drew blood in Boston. The the Parliament in London decided once again to concede on the issue of taxation, if I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
All the townshend duties were repealed save one, the tax on tea. It proved to another error in judgment on the part of the British. Sorry, the Massachusetts legislature was reconvened, despite calls by by some to continue the tea boycott until all taxes were repealed. Most American colonists resumed importation. The events in Boston from 1768 through 1770 were not soon forgotten. Legal squabbles were one thing, but bloodshed was another. Despite the verdict of the soldiers' trial, Americans did not forget the lesson they had learned from this experience. What was the lesson? Well, learned that the British would use force when necessary to keep the Americans obedient. If it could happen in Boston, where would it happen next?
All right, thank you. So, yeah, Parliament backed off a little bit. They said, okay, this problem we've got with these angry colonists in America. This is a real big deal, and we don't want it to blow up any more than it already was. So they back off a little bit. Um, and so, oh, Brittany, thanks for logging in. How are you doing? Brittany, we're discussing the American Revolution, or the lead up to the American Revolution. Um, and we talked about it last week, and we're talking about it today. Today we're talking about the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. I'll share the recordings, and you can backtrack, and you can look at the reading and kind of catch up on your own at some point. Okay. Um, but yeah, but it says the events in Boston from 1768 to 1770 were not soon forgotten. The other, the whole colonies, 13 colonies, were watching what's happening in Boston, hearing about it, and saying, "My goodness, these, we already didn't, we weren't in love with being British anymore, and now we definitely don't trust them. It's not, something's going to happen." So, the Tea Act and Boston Tea Party, 1773. Um, okay, so what's interesting about this time period is there is a lot of economics involved. Um, the reason a country like Britain sets up colonies across the globe, in America, in South America, in Africa, in Asia, like I said, this was a period of colonization in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. The reason Britain cares to set up colonies is to gain resources, right? In 1620, 1620, when the Pilgrims came over, and then a whole bunch of other British people came over to set up colonies in the 1600s, set up British colonies in America. The Pilgrims came over, we say, for religious freedom, right? But so they could worship God in the way that they wanted. But plenty of other people, including people on that boat that weren't part of the Pilgrims group, were coming to the Americas, coming to America, North and South America, to make money. There's wide open land. You can farm. It's nice and warm in the American South. So they grew tobacco. They grew cotton, right? They used slavery to do it, but they made money. Um, the reason you have colonies is to make money, right? Britain becomes stronger through the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. Britain, London, England, Britain becomes stronger because they've got a ton of colonies across the whole world. So what's interesting about this story is you have angry people, people like you and me reacting to these things that are happening. You read about in the newspaper the Boston Massacre, you're going to have a reaction to that. You're going to say, "Oh, that stinks. These British really stink." But there's also a lot of economics involved. Now, economics isn't always exciting, but let's dig in a little bit to economics. We have taxes. We have a company called the British East India Company. Let me just jump in here, or let me explain through reading. It says this is 1773, so we're still, before 1776. It says the British East India Company was on the brink of financial collapse. Okay, this is a big company. They sold tea and other things, but mostly tea. It's a big company, and it's partly the British East India Company is like it's a company, but it's also like very related to the government. Like the government kind of owns that company, the British government. So it says it was on the brink of financial collapse. Lord North, one of the people in Parliament, hatched a scheme to deal simultaneously with the ailing corporation and the problem of taxing the colonies. He decided to grant the British East India Company a trading monopoly with the American colonies. Okay, what is a monopoly? If a company has a monopoly, what does that mean?
That is how will I say, individualized, that single something.
Right, single, yeah, mono, right? Mono means one. A monopoly means, yeah, there's one company that's there. So if the British government gives the British East India Company a trading monopoly with the Americans, that means that the Americans can only buy goods from that one company, the British East India Company. So that's the way to it says, he can control, he can help the ailing corporation, the hurting financially British East India Company. He can help that company because it gives them all the business from the American colonists, and you can tax the American colonies better because it's just the one company, so you can control it a lot more easily. It says a tax on tea would be maintained, but the company would actually be able to sell its tea for a price that was lower than before. Okay, so the Americans, if I'm just a guy in Pennsylvania, I love tea. British people love tea. I can buy tea for cheaper, which is good for me, but I'm still getting taxed on that tea, and the tax is going to the government. Okay, sounds like a good idea, right? Everybody wins. It says a monopoly doesn't allow for competition. As such, the British East India Company could lower its prices. Um, you don't have to pay for advertising because there's no other companies selling tea. It's easier. It just costs less money when you have a monopoly. Paragraph 25. The colonists, Lord North hoped, would be happy to receive cheaper tea and willing to pay the tax. This would have the dual result of saving the tea company and securing compliance from Americans on the tax issue because they were boycotting tea, right? Or they were buying illegal tea that wasn't taxed before. So now if you're going to you got to force those Americans to pay the tea tax. So if it's cheaper, if it's cheaper to buy the legal tea than to buy the illegal tea, then hopefully the Americans won't boycott anymore and they'll just buy the right tea. It says it was a brilliant plan. There was, of course, one major flaw in his thinking. Brittany, could you read paragraph 26?
Hold on, give me a minute. Mm. 26. The colonists saw through his thinly veiled flaws to encourage tax payments. Furthermore, they wondered how long the monopoly would keep prices low. Activities were busy again.
Activists
Act,
activists were
ad,
busy again
what is that?
advocating boycott, advocating. So they were like they was jacking it, like they was jacking the protest
Alright,
and
many were further British ships carrying the controversial
controversial,
cargo were were met with threats and violence in Berkeley or
virtually all colonial ports.
Mhm. These were usually
Sufficient
sufficient to convince and ships to turn around. And Annapolis
citizens
citizen burns a ship and the tea carried.
carried
Boston, of course, react in similarly extreme fashion.
reacted in a similarly extreme fashion.
All right, thank you, thank you. So so yeah, you have this pushback to this idea. These Americans are, frankly, yeah, cheaper tea is great, but they're sick of being bossed around. For 150 years, they've been British colonies, and they're just tired of it. You can't buy them off with cheaper tea, right? Again, British people love to drink tea even today, but uh, they can't be bought. They saw through the plan. Um, they did boycott it. And then it says in Annapolis, Maryland, citizens burned a ship and the tea it carried. Boston, of course, reacted in a similarly extreme fashion. Okay, so next up, we're going to read the Boston Tea Party. Um, Olawakimi, could you read paragraphs 27 and 28?
Okay. The Boston Tea Party. Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson allowed 3 ships carrying tea to enter Boston Harbor before the tax could be collected. Bostonians took action. On a cold December night, radical townspeople stormed the ships and tossed 342 chests of tea into the water. Disguised as Native Americans, the offenders could not be identified. The damage in modern American dollars exceeded $750,000. Not a single British East India Company chest of tea bought for the 13 colonies reached its destination. Not a single American colonist had a cup of that tea. Ooh.
Okay, and that's an interesting fact, and that's I believe that to be true. So the British gave a monopoly to one company, but it totally blew up in their face. Well, literally blew up in their face. It didn't work. Um, Not a single British East India Company chest of tea bound for the 13 colonies reached its destination. Nobody, it did not, they did not sell any tea in the colonies. So you have the Boston Tea Party, and it's, here's a famous old painting. It was at night. This picture puts it at the day, but that's because nobody wants a painting of darkness. Um, they were dressed as Native Americans. I think they were dressed as Mohawk Indians. It wasn't necessarily to hide their identities. I think a lot of historians believe they were disguised as Mohawk Indians. Um, and I don't really know. It wasn't to hide their identities because these Bostonians were happy to to be known as the people who threw the chests of tea, 342 chests of tea into the water. Um, I don't know I think it was symbolic that they were dressed as Native Americans. I don't really know why. Some symbolism there. It wasn't really to hide their identities. They weren't prosecuted because at the time, um, people in Boston liked the fact that they basically ruined all this tea. Um, So yeah, they were not. Nobody was ever. I believe nobody was ever charged with a crime from the Boston Tea Party, although it was a crime what they did. Okay, so that's the Boston Tea Party. It was a protest, um, a violent protest. They damaged stuff. They didn't. Nobody was harmed, I don't think, but they damaged. It says $750,000 equivalent today of tea, but it was a protest. They were protesting not only the tax, but also that the government gave this company a monopoly. Like they were being used, right? The American colonies were being used, and they were sick of it, and they'd had enough. So in reaction to that, um, the British government got even more angry. So now we have the Intolerable Acts, 1774. It's just like we talked about last week, when a parent and child, when there's a disagreement and people get frustrated and people get stubborn, there's nothing worse than let's say a little toddler, right, who's just learning how to be disciplined, just kind of feeling out, how what they can get away with. There's nothing worse than a stubborn little toddler kid, little boy, little girl, and then a parent who, I mean, we all parents. I hate it when my kids don't listen to me, right? So there's that frustration. Your blood starts to boil because like you're frustrated because you're not being listened to. It's the same back and forth. It's the same thing happening between the British government and the colonies. Okay, the British government is the parent who thinks, well, my child should do what I say just because I said it, right? We all think that sometimes. And the British colonies are the child saying, I don't want to be bossed around. Or maybe it's a teenager instead of a toddler. But, you know, it's becoming increasingly problematic. And now people have died in the Boston Massacre. You have British soldiers in Boston, in New York, in Philadelphia, in the big cities. They're as police. Okay. So something's going to happen. So it says the Intolerable Acts, 1774. Someone was going to pay. Parliament was utterly fed up with colonial antics. Okay, just the craziness of it. The British could tolerate strongly worded letters or trade boycotts. They could put up with defiant legislatures, the state legislatures, and harass customs officials to an extent. But they saw the destruction of 342 chests of tea belonging to the British East India Company as wanton destruction of property by Boston thugs who did not even have the courage to admit responsibility. Okay, so it said they can put up with some things. They can put up with a boycott and strongly worded letters, and they can put up with maybe some harassment of customs officials, tax collectors. Okay, but when the crowd, the riot of Boston people threw 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor and ruined property, that was too much. It says someone was going to pay. Parliament passed 4 acts that together the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Okay, so these are 4 acts. And it's interesting to see, this was all written on purpose. It was in reaction to the Boston Tea Party. This is punishment for the Boston Tea Party. So the first one is Boston Port Act, an act to discontinue in such manner and for such time as are therein mentioned. I think this might be actually the original text. So it's kind of confusing, kind of written in an old style. Okay, an act to discontinue in such manner and for or such time as are therein mentioned, the landing and discharging, lading, which is like filling of a ship, or shipping of goods, wares, and merchandise at the town and within the harbor of Boston in the province of Massachusetts Bay in North America. So the discontinuing of shipping anything in or out of Boston Harbor. Okay. So that the Boston Port Act says, hey, Boston, if you're going to treat our ships that way, we're nice enough to send you tea to buy. And if you're going to treat it that way, you don't get to do anything. And it just says, for as long as we want, basically. No goods will come in or out of Boston Harbor for sale, period. Okay, that's going to hurt Boston. Boston is like the main port of New England, right? Half of the colonies, basically. It's the only big city in New England. So everything that comes in and out of New England comes in and out through Boston. So that's going to hurt the city of Boston. Then it says the Massachusetts Government Act, an act for the better regulating government of the province of Massachusetts Bay in New England. What that does is it takes out it, or it says it does. It removes the Massachusetts government, the state government, and governor, and the British government can put in its own people. Okay, so they just replace the angry anti-British government in Massachusetts. They just replace it with British people who are going to get along and do what they're told. So that's a big deal. You're replacing a government just because we said so. Administration of Justice Act. It says an act for the impartial administration of justice in the case of persons questioned for any acts done by them in the execution of the law or for the suppression of riots and tumults in the province of Massachusetts Bay in New England. So this just changes and I think there's more to it than that. It changes what happens when you're arrested. I think it changed the courts. Instead of going to an American court, I think they were then shipped to England to go to a British court. So if it says it for the suppression of riots. So if you were arrested in a disturbance of some kind, if the next Boston Tea Party happens, if you were arrested, you wouldn't be put in court in America, in the colonies. They would ship you back to London and you'd be in court there. And boy, are you less likely to like the outcome, right? So they're changing the court system. They're changing the government. They're changing the economics with the Boston Tea Act or Boston Port Act. And Quebec, this is, like I said, there is British colonies up into Canada. So this is an act for making effectual provision for the government of the province of Quebec in North America. Not a big concern, but it was a British colony, and so they took over the government in Quebec. I think there was also some protests going on up there. So these are big deals. The Boston Port Act, probably number one. Of course, Massachusetts Government Act, you're replacing the state government or colony government. Big deal. These are big deals. So, final paragraph. It says, throughout the colonies, the message was clear. What could happen in Massachusetts could happen anywhere. The British had gone too far. Supplies were sent to the beaten up colonies from the other 12 colonies. For the first time since the Stamp Act crisis, an intercolonial conference was called. So, representatives from every colony was called. I think they went, it says Philadelphia. It was under these tense circumstances that the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on September 5th, 1774. This was the first real step that the colonists took towards self-government and revolution. So they had had enough, right? This tension between the British and the American colonists had come to its final point. Neither side can take it any longer. So the colonists illegally, this would have been totally illegal, they illegally pulled together representatives from every colony and they said something's got to happen. They called it the Continental Congress. We now call it the First Continental Congress because this group met for a couple of years. I think it was this group ends up signing the Declaration of Independence 2 years later. And then later they call the Second Continental Congress. So there's two different groups. We call this the First Continental Congress. It's a group of people specifically called together to revolt, to have a revolution, to overthrow or break away from the government. And so it leads down the road to the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Okay, so we see through a mixture of unfair taxes and the presence of a police power of the British soldiers, the tensions rise and rise and rise, and then you have the Boston Massacre, and then you have the Boston Tea Party, and then the British reply with what they called the Intolerable Acts, and the colonists said, enough, we can't take it anymore, we don't want to be British, right? We want to be our own country. Okay, so there's a lot there. Any questions on these events or these topics? Is any of this new? Ola Wakimi, you had said you'd never heard of the Boston Tea Party or the Boston Massacre.
No.
So, and like I said, this was, the 1700s plus a little bit of space time on either side is the era of colonization. So this frustration of colonists happens maybe not at that moment, but down certainly into the 1800s. You have across the globe all these colonies reaching the same conclusion. We don't want to be British anymore. We don't want to be French anymore. We don't want to be Spanish anymore. We want to be our own country. And sometimes it happens across the globe violently, right? As we see in American history, they fought an American Revolutionary War. The British said, no, we're not going to let you go. You are British. We are going to keep you British. We're not going to let you go. So they fight a war. Sometimes it happens violently. Sometimes it happened peacefully, especially into the 1800s after the American Revolution happened. And then, a couple other big time revolutions happened. And then mid 1800s, some of these countries say, the French say, you know what? We'll just let our colonies go. We'll cut them free legally, more or less peacefully. Okay. But, India and Africa and South America, our histories are still affected by those revolutions even today. Okay, so any questions at all? Talked about the Boston Massacre, the Townshend Acts, the Stamp Act. Okay, the American Revolution didn't happen overnight. It happened in the 10 years, 15 years, really 150 years that the British colonies in America were British colonies. It doesn't happen overnight. It comes to it's like a pot. It comes to a slow boil over time. So I will send this out. I would encourage you read this weekend, sit down for half an hour, read this over. When you do something like that, wait a few days and then look at it again. That, in my opinion, that's what I always try to do when I really want to learn something. Wait a few days and then just look it over. You don't have to read it 10 times. Read it once, but when you do that, it puts it back into your head and it puts it in deeper into your long-term memory. So I'll send this out. Brittany, I will this afternoon. I'll send out a recording of this and last week. If you want to watch the recordings, you can. If you just want to do the readings, you can do that too. If anybody has any questions, let me know. We will continue, and I'm going to send out an email to all the people that have come over the last several weeks and months. I think we'll keep doing this. We will bounce around in history and study different things in American history, and we'll try to piece it all together like a big puzzle piece. But I think my 4-week crash course I think I'll stop doing that for now. So we'll do readings every week. We'll look at things, maybe watch videos or something, but look at a different topic each week in American history. So I would encourage you keep coming back. I'm going to send out an email to all those other people who've joined us in the past, and I'm saying, hey, we're going to do something a little different. So maybe we can get a nice crowd. It's always more fun with more people, more questions, and people's experiences and stuff. So, but thank you guys for logging in. I'll send an email out later this afternoon. If you need anything, let me know. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Have a
Yeah.
good day, everybody.
Bye. And you too.
See you later.